Good afternoon and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our Global Fraud Trends webinar. My name is Kim Gerald and I represent our Global Marketing Department. Just a couple of housekeeping notes for you. There is a question and answer button in your top right-hand corner. You can click on that to ask any questions of our speakers during the webinar. Also wanted to let you all know that we are recording this session and we'll send you a link to the recording in a couple of days along with the presentation that we have promised you. With that said, I'd like to introduce Dan Draper, Product Marketing Manager.
Dan Draper, and I have the product marketing responsibility for Cineverse's risk management solutions. And in that respect, I will be serving as your moderator today. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you on behalf of my Cineverse colleagues. And thank you very much for taking the time out to participate in today's Global Fraud Trends Review webinar. I'm going to introduce the speakers in just a minute, who really do have some delicious content for you. But before we get into that, there are a few points I would like to cover just to settle us into today's session. We will be conducting a poll, and that becomes very clear in terms of how that will work when we get to that part of the agenda. But I just wanted to introduce that before we get going. And that poll focuses on a concept that we've been assessing at Cineverse for some months now. And it's all about trying to establish a consistent and dependable reference point by which we could measure the value of fraud prevented in financial terms. Now, we're interested in that because on some occasions it could help us to articulate to our customers the value that our fraud solutions bring to their businesses. And we also suspect that those kind of conversations might be useful to you to have with your CFO in terms of illustrating how well the fraud mitigation is working in your teams and the financial benefit that is bringing to your businesses. And the poll really, therefore, represents a unique opportunity as we've assembled this body of expertise on today's webinar to assess whether indeed that method would be relevant to you and to help us perhaps fine-tune some of the calibration within it. Now, I am really encouraging you to participate in the poll. As I say, it is a unique opportunity. But the results come in an interactive manner. We get to see them all in real time, which I'm particularly looking forward to. But I don't want that to put anyone off in terms of the confidentiality, because those results are completely aggregated. We can't attribute any one response to any one individual. So please feel rest assured about the confidentiality of your replies. And if you do participate in the poll, thank you very much in advance of doing so, because your feedback will be very valuable to us. Next point is I need to make, in order to avoid confusion, in addition to the poll, we also have a quiz. But they are completely different activities. The quiz actually comes up before the poll, and that's relatively speaking, a light-hearted activity that is local and private to you. And we've introduced it because we think it will help to engage your minds on what you will be seeing and hearing. And it gives you an opportunity to test some assumptions you may have on how fraud manifests itself around the world. And soon after the quiz, the answers become very apparent when you start to see the globally amassed empirical data being presented to you. And therefore, you get to validate your instinct, seeing if your answers are actually borne out in that statistical reality. It's not all about us asking you questions. You'll be pleased to hear. We want this very much to be a two-way thing. And you have the facility, as Kim has suggested, to supply us with questions, and we will do our utmost to respond to all of those in real time and create that dialogue which we all like. We must be strict on timekeeping, so we will be finishing at 59.5 minutes. So if we don't get back to you during today's session, we will follow up with an email response post the webinar. So please don't feel that you've been forgotten, and make the most of that facility. Final point before I introduce the speakers. As a result of participating in the webinar, you will be given access to an associated report. And the content of that report very much mirrors the content of the webinar. So there's no need to keep a record or take notes as we go through today's content. That report is dripping with statistical information and facts and insight on global fraud trends. So over to our speakers now. Today's session will be led by James Stewart, who is a director in the product management team in our risk management group. James has many years experience of designing and implementing fraud management solutions for telecommunications operators. He's been at Syniverse for 8 years. Prior to that, he had a fair chunk of his career at Fair Isaac, where he was actually involved in specifying the design for Neartrade. James is a name that I suspect will be familiar to all of you in his capacity as chairman of the GSMA Roaming and Interconnect Fraud and Security Group. James will be supported by Jason Tikikara, who is a senior product manager in the same team. Jason equally has several years' experience of the design of fraud management solutions. Previously at Subex, where he held senior roles in their consulting and engineering department, and Jason is a certified fraud examiner. So that's it from me for now, and I'll hand over to James, who will introduce the agenda.
Good. Thank you very much, Dan. Hopefully you can hear me loud and clear now. And thank you, everyone, for joining today's call, for giving up your time for today's call. We have some valuable people on the call. All of you are valuable, but if you've got feedback or questions you'd like to ask during the meeting, we'd love to hear from you. And if there isn't time to hear from you during the call, then please do email me or Jason directly, and our email addresses will go up at the end of this presentation. So firstly, to talk about what we're going to cover today, this is largely about statistics, and that makes it sound rather dull, I'm afraid, but it isn't at all. We believe these statistics will be very valuable to you. So if you work for an operator, your CFO is concerned about profitability. He can hardly expect you in the fraud department to be bringing in revenue, so he's looking for the cost savings that he can expect from reducing fraud. So we're all expected to be working smarter to find fraud faster. We're expected to be reducing losses and increase profitability. So that's going to give us two problems. First one is, how do we find fraud faster? And to do that, it helps to understand certain patterns of fraud, to look at the probability of certain patterns arising. And if you understand the patterns of fraud that are going on today, you're in a better position to defend against them. So that's the first part of what we're going to be covering today. So as an example, if you know that roamers in Spain are making repeated calls to Ecuador, for example, that pattern becomes an indicative pattern that you should be looking out for, so that you can set your profiles accordingly in your fraud systems to detect and identify fraud in that scenario. Now, if we can find fraud faster, we can stop it faster. And in stopping it faster, the value of fraud found will reduce. You know, if we know that fraud is occurring at $100 an hour and we stop it at just half an hour, you're only going to see $50 worth of fraud and so on. So faster we detect it and stop it, the less the fraud is there. And that makes it much harder to justify your performance or justify the role of a fraud department to your CFO. And that is the second part that Dan alluded to just now in talking about how do we measure fraud prevented. And we'll be coming to that towards the end of the presentation. So the trends are important. Understanding the global fraud environment is important. And I hope you're going to find today's presentation useful. But as I said before, we'll very much welcome your feedback on this. And we want to be doing this on a more regular basis and to give you indications of how trends are changing with time. So in this agenda, I'm going to start by saying a little bit about Cineverse, because some of you may not know us. I'll give you some information on what it is that we've been doing that has led to this event, where the data comes from. And then the main part of the discussion will be around the statistics we've gathered from data when we analyze the fraud, when we're looking at data from over 100 operators, seeing fraud from the roamers, from those operators roaming all over the globe, so that we can identify those trends, and this is what we're reporting back to you. Now, please keep your eyes open for the poll that Dan mentioned earlier. It's going to be very quick and easy for you to respond to that, and we'll be able to share the results during the presentation. So with that, I'm going to go straight into the presentation now and start just by setting a little bit of context. So the telco community as a whole looks out, in particular fraud departments, look out for sharing information. They want to understand and quantify the risks, and people want to work together to diminish fraud. I regularly attend the GSMA fraud and security group meetings, and there is a very healthy appetite for sharing information there and for helping one another. So if you don't attend that and you have the opportunity to go, I strongly recommend it. And similarly, the CFCA in North America, they have similar events, and they also hold events in Europe. And all operators are looking to share information. So this webinar is about sharing information without breaching any confidentiality. So before I get into the detail of what it is we're sharing, just a little bit about Cineverse at a glance. And since this is a presentation about statistics, I'll introduce Cineverse with some statistics. So many of you will know that Cineverse is heavily involved in the roaming environment, but that's certainly not all that we do. And it doesn't mention it here on this slide, but certainly in the fraud detection and prevention area and revenue assurance, which we collectively refer to as risk management, we've deployed our solutions with mobile and fixed line operators, both domestic and roaming. We deal with voice and data. But also you can see on this slide that we have a large IPX backbone that serves over 500 operators. When people ask me what it is Cineverse does, I suppose in a nutshell, a way of describing our role for everything we do, it's about helping connect people and organizations. And in that, we reach over 7 billion devices globally. So with that global customer base, we're in an excellent position to then provide these fraud and revenue assurance overlay services as well. From an employee perspective, we've got around 2,500 or 2,400 employees in Cineverse, spread across about 29 countries. So at Cineverse, I didn't want to spend too much talking about Cineverse today. I really want to get straight into the statistics. So first of all, I'll say a little bit about where this data has come from. And you may be wondering, how reliable is the data that we're going to present? Where does it come from? So many Cineverse risk management customers are cloud-based. We provide fraud protection to about 120 operators, and this is where we get the data. And there's a limit to what we can share with you because the data we handle is private, and nothing I'm going to share with you today can be associated with any single operator. Because that would be a breach of confidentiality. But the cumulative data tells a story and reveals some very interesting trends that we can share. So the data I'm presenting to you now covers 10,000 cases with calls and events originating from around 150 countries. And these cases are they're for voice calls. We've taken out data and messaging, and they are for cases which have been identified as being fraud. So any cases that we've highlighted which we've been told are not fraud, there's no point in presenting on those particular cases, and we've removed those. Just to get the language straight here so that you understand what it is we're referring to as we go through the presentation, this slide is a little bit important for you to understand the terminology. So first of all, on the left-hand side here, we have the home country, or HPMN in the roaming environment. And this is the country of, here is the country of the origin of the subscriber, where the subscriber service provider is based. So they then travel to the roamed destination, which is the VPMN, and this is the originating country for the calls that are being made, the origin of the calls. So I'll be referring to this as the originating country. And then they make calls to the terminating destination, the terminating country, where the calls are terminated. And we'll use this graphic at intervals through the presentation just to be clear about which part of the picture we're talking about. Are we talking about the home countries of the subscribers, or the origination of the calls, or the termination of the calls? Now, Dan said I'd bring up a quiz early on. I'm not expecting you to feed back to the group or to me in the presentation, but this is just to get you thinking a little bit. So the first question is really to understand whether you think that more fraud would occur at the weekend, or does it occur during the week? So the average daily number of fraud cases at the weekend compared to the weekday, is it higher, or similar, or lower? Is it lower at weekend or higher at weekend? And we'll come back to these questions at the end, but I don't think that's a difficult question. You'll probably have very firm ideas on that already. Now, which month would you expect to be the peak for the number of fraud cases? Make a stab at guessing that and then see if you're right. And when would you expect to be the lowest number of fraud cases in the year? And which country would you expect to be struck by the most cases of fraud? And finally, which countries would you expect to have the most cases for originating call fraud? Obviously, this question, which country would you expect to be struck, you could be thinking from the point of view of HPMN, which operators are going to be hit as HPMN, as the original home operator for each country, or is this the originating country? The last question is very clearly focused on originating calls. So those are the questions for you to consider, and we'll come back to that later in the presentation. So into the statistics. So this chart is going to look at when fraud occurs, in which months of the year does fraud occur. Now you have to remember this relates to global results. So summer in Europe would be winter in New Zealand, for example. Would you expect the trends across the globe to cancel one another out? Or maybe you'd expect there to be the frauds that occur in the Northern Hemisphere. Perhaps there's more fraud in the Northern Hemisphere than in the Southern Hemisphere. And so there may be a dominant effect from the Northern Hemisphere. So do the seasons matter or not? What would you expect to see? So first of all, I've put up some results for 2013. The reason I'm going back in time here is it's worth looking at whether the trends repeat themselves from year to year, and therefore justify that the pattern we're seeing is a repeatable trend, and therefore something that brings a lot of value in understanding of when fraud peaks. So in 2013, you can see that fraud was fraudsters largely favored the summer months in the Northern Hemisphere. And then there's a dip as we go down into winter and a slight peak as we come into the new year. So to compare that the following year, 2014, you can see initially there's actually a very nice mirroring from year to year of what's going on. But I'm afraid then it all goes horribly wrong. So here you can see as we get into August, for some reason, there's a big trough. Now, next time I run these statistics, maybe it would be interesting to look at similar results for roaming data, not against fraud, but against roaming data generally, to see if the level of fraud actually aligns with the level of roaming that's going on at the time. Because it's possible that at this time, and I don't remember what was going on in the news at the time in August 2014, but if there was an event like terrorism or bird flu or some other such event, then that can have a marked effect on the statistics. Indeed, it could be a success by the police in breaking a criminal syndicate. As an example of that, I know that when the FBI arrested a major perpetrator of fraud around 2012, operators reported a big reduction in international revenue share fraud globally. So you will see anomalies in patterns. What we have to do is dig into why those anomalies might be. And if you've got ideas on that, I'd love to hear from you for this particular one. I don't have an answer to this one at the moment. But let's look at 2015. So 2015 is the dark blue line here, and it's really not very conclusive. We are seeing a bit of a peak around the summer months, but it's not very conclusive. And soon we'll have the data for 2016 as well. We don't have that yet, and we'll map that onto here. But really, the only takeaway I can give you from this is while there may be something of a peak of fraud around the summer months, this is going to chop and change. We have to remain vigilant at all times, and expecting there to be a reduction of fraud at a particular time of year could be dangerous, because one year it might be low at that time, another time it might be high. So we have to remain vigilant throughout the year. Now I'd like to look at a similar exercise, but looking at days of the week. How would you expect fraud to vary through the days of the week? Would you expect it to be higher at weekends? Now let's consider Friday to be part of a weekend. In many parts of the world, Friday is part of a weekend. So we're going to take Friday, Saturday, Sunday as a weekend in this. So what do we have here? We can see in 2013, fraud rose significantly, not hugely, but significantly from Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Interestingly, a slight bump around Wednesday as well. Now, this is the number of cases. I bet if you were to look at the value of fraud, if we could agree on how we measure the value of fraud, I would bet that the value of fraud at the weekend would be much, much higher, because there's more of a tendency to make cases extend longer, keep calls open longer, because people are hoping to get away without being detected so rapidly. You start fraud at the start of the weekend, and you hope you're not going to get caught till the end of the weekend if you're a fraudster. 2014, similarly, we see that slight bump around Wednesday, but more to the point, we see a huge, dramatic rise in fraud around the weekend. And again, so it's the same for 2013, 14, and 15. Interestingly, the bump around Wednesday in 2015 is even more pronounced compared to weekend. I don't know why there should be this midweek bump, but it seems that fraudsters are a little bit slow in getting going after the weekend. They have a peak of activity in midweek, and then they die down in their vigor towards as they approach the weekend. So this illustrates the need to be vigilant 7 days a week throughout the weekends as well as during the week. So moving on into where fraud is actually hitting. Now, you'll remember early in the presentation, I put up this graphic to make the distinction between the home country, where the subscriber took out service originally, then where they roamed to, and so that'll be the originating country of calls, and then the terminating country of calls. So first, we're looking at the home country, and we have compared the number of the proportion of cases that occur in the top 10 countries. And we see that Brazil is out there at over 25% of the cases, as illustrated by the red line here. Now, this is for cases, the orange lines indicate the number of cases for the case count ending 31st of October. I've also got in here a gray line, which is similar 12-month period. So both of these bars represent 12-month periods. But the gray bar is a comparison to 12 months ending in June 2016, just to see if anything has changed at all. So here we're using our global data to find out where the SIMs were originally acquired, i.e. the HPMN country. And here we're seeing 25% came from Brazil, for example. And about 50% of all the fraud cases seem to come from a combination of Brazil, UK, and Mexican SIMs. It's probably a good idea at this point if I hand over to Jason and ask you, Jason, to go into more detail of this so that people can break down the numbers a bit and understand what's going on behind the numbers. Could I ask you to pick that up?
Yeah, sure, James. Thank you. Let me just share my screen. Yeah. So, James, as you have rightly mentioned, Brazil, UK, and Mexico contribute more than half of the cases reported in this period. And what we are going to do is we have created an interactive application through which we can understand the various patterns that are emerging from the from these fraud statistics. So what you see on the screen right now is the interactive application, and you could see the top countries are represented in terms of bubble charts. You could see the home country, the originating country, and the terminating country being represented. The size of the bubble illustrates or represents the proportionate amount that that particular country contribute towards the fraud. For example, in case of Brazil, it's 26%, and the nearest contender, United Kingdom, is contributing 15%. And you could see the size truly represents in that manner. What we also have in the interactive session is we have also mapped these countries back into specific regions. So we also get a regional view in terms of how the fraud is being split across multiple regions, right? So specifically in this particular case on home or HPMN or home continents, you could see that South America is contributing much large as compared to the other regions. In fact, South America and Europe combined, when you combine them, they contribute almost half of the almost fraudulent cases. Or the SIMs from these continents or regions are used for are involved in more than half of the fraudulent incidents. What is also interesting in this interactive application is you can actually drill down and perform a what-if analysis on different cases. For in this instance, let's look at the case of United Kingdom. As and when I click on United Kingdom, you would see that the various charts as well as the data gets refreshed in relation to the data that I'm drilling down to. So you could see that from United Kingdom perspective, the SIMs from United Kingdom, almost 40% or 37% of the instances when these SIMs were traveling in Spain, they resulted in potential fraudulent cases. And in almost 8% of the cases, the calls were getting terminated to Cuba. Now, let's use this interactive application to understand how how the trend varies between the regions. Let's take an example of South America, which is the largest contributor in terms of potential frauds from the home country perspective, home region perspective. You could see that almost half of the instances the SIMs from South America was roaming in European region, and the calls were getting terminated to, you can almost say that equally between Africa, Europe, and North America. Now, what's going to be interesting is with North America as the point of reference for home continent, you could see that almost 2 by 3 of instances where the North American SIMs were involved, those SIMs were roaming within North America, and the terminating calls were happening within North America. So this clearly shows a strong correlation or a strong clustering being happening within the same continent itself. It is also interesting to notice that the same trend is visible in case of Africa as well, where almost 2 by 3 of the cases which relating to African region, the rumors or the instances, the originating region ended up being Africa itself, as well as the terminating region ended up as Africa itself. This pattern is not, it cannot be generalized in the data set that we have. As we move on to Europe, we see that this pattern gets broken. There is almost a similar pattern. However, you would see that the top 3 clusters have got much more equal distribution. For example, in case of Europe, the traffics are getting terminated almost equally between North America, Africa, and Europe. So what it tells us is, broadly, there are two patterns that are emerging. One, regions where we have strong bonding in terms of the clusters that are formed. The clusters that you could see is mostly to the first degree, and these regions are North America and Africa. Whereas in cases of South America and Europe, from their perspective, the top the top regions are clustered between 2 or 3 regions. Let's test out how this turns out for Asia region. In case of Asia region, again, it follows the path of, you could see that it's following the path of having a cluster with more than 2 to 3 countries. So in case of Asia, although half of the instances, the Asian region itself is being used as a terminating country as well as an originating country. However, almost 1 by 3 of cases actually happens, or the other half actually happens outside the region. Now let's look at the statistics in terms of the originating countries, or VPMNs. The period ending October, what we have noticed is United States emerged as one of the hottest destinations for originating scenarios. This has followed the pattern from the last year. Yes, Dan?
Sorry to cut across you there. We have a question coming in from the audience from Avisoye, who is asking, what do you actually categorize as the home country in this particular part of the presentation?
Okay. So as we have seen in earlier slides, a home country is a country to which the MC belongs to, or it is a country wherein which the owner of the SIM or the operator of the SIM is operating from. So you can see that it's more like the HPMS. Does that answer the question? Dan, is there any more questions coming in?
We've covered them all thus far, Jason. Thank you very much.
Okay. So as we saw earlier, in case of originating countries or VPMNs, what we are seeing, the data that we are seeing in for a period ending October, United States, Spain, and Peru are actually at the top 3 positions, and in fact, they have retained their positions from last year. What's interesting to see here is the period ending October, we have new entrants coming into the top 10 scenario. We have France as well as Canada, which were not in the top 10 list in the prior period, which was ending at June. we saw them jumping into the top 10 scenario during this period. Now let's jump back to our interactive application, to look at some of the patterns here. So from the originating region perspective, Europe is emerging as the top contributor there. Let's try and look at what Europe has to offer. And if you look at within the Europe, Spain is emerging as the top, as the top contender in terms of originating countries concerned. Let's drill down to Spain and see how the pattern emerges. And you can see in almost half of those instances where the SIMs roaming in Spain resulted in fraud, the SIMs were belonging to operators in the United Kingdom. And you can say that in almost all the instances, or almost half of the instances, the calls were getting terminated to Algeria, Morocco, Ecuador, or Belarus. And this is an interesting pattern. There is a strong correlation coming here, which says, almost half of the instances when a SIM is roaming in Spain, they resulted in perpetrating fraud. Let's look back at the scenario and analyze from the regional perspective. As the individual countries represent, the regions also follow almost in the same pattern in case of home as well as originating continent or region. And most of the calls were getting terminated. In fact, half of them were getting terminated to Africa. But what's also interesting is almost a quarter of those calls were also getting terminated within Europe. So Dan, is there any question popping up? I could see the chat is going red.
Jason, yes, I have another question for you. It's a very good one. What's being asked is that does that mean that most of the HPNMs aren't actually employing fraud management solutions? And that's why they're appearing high up in this statistical analysis, is the implication of that question.
Yes, that's an interesting question, and to a large extent you can argue that that's the case. However, we have to keep in mind that we are talking about a roaming scenario, and hence we need not require only the home countries to subscribe to us. We also are able to view in scenarios in which the VPN countries have subscribed to our service, and we are providing the fraud monitoring solution to them, and then we get a view on those HPMN countries as well. So we could say that it's partly right, but because of the nature of roaming, we can say that we have a fair coverage to truly represent what is happening out there. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Jason, I think I'd also add that, for example, you're seeing the UK up there as a major source of fraud. We're not saying the UK operators aren't monitoring for fraud, but I think that's partially a quirk of the numbering scheme in the UK, which leaves itself open to abuse. So it's known that a lot of fraud relates to the UK because of the number ranges and the way they're applied in the UK. And also you're seeing there that a lot of the people are traveling from the UK to Spain. We have a lot of people who travel between the UK and Spain, but it's well known that there's a lot of fraud coming out of Spain. And for example, in the GSMA fraud and security group, there's been discussion with the Spanish police and with Europol and people because it's been identified as quite a hot source of fraud. So it's a good example of where you see patterns of people going from one location into a specific country and then from that country calling certain locations. And it's worth actually noting those locations and noting those patterns in your fraud systems. It doesn't immediately mean that someone is fraudulent, but if there are a lot of repeated calls being made in that particular pattern, then it's certainly something that needs to be monitored and looked for.
Absolutely right, James. And it also depends upon the global events that are happening, which which result in a specific region having more traffic getting generated. So you're absolutely right. There could be reasons relating to detection of fraud. There could be reasons relating to a global event which influence the overall traffic to bias towards a particular direction. Yeah. So moving on to the third perspective, which is from the terminating perspective. You could see Cuba is actually topping the list with almost 1/5 of the incidents, the fraud incidents actually terminating in Cuba. And this is perhaps more in line with the recent CFCA survey as well, where Cuba has retained the top destination for almost the last two reports that has been published by CFCA. What's also interesting in the data that we have here is Cuba and Tunisia, the second position is occupied by Tunisia, and in fact, the last 12 months period that we were looking at, Tunisia and Cuba has retained their position from the previous data, the previous report that we have published. Now, going back to our interactive session to further drill down on the incidents. Let's look at what is really contributing towards the Cuban terminating scenario. Let's drill down to Cuba to see, and all of a sudden it emerges that the biggest contributor, or you can say almost 40% of the instances, the victims were SIMs belonging to Mexico and Brazil. In almost all instances, they were traveling to United States, and they resulted in fraud. If you closely monitor, this could be explained with the fact of a global event. If you go back to the time frame, you could see that there was Copa America, which was happening earlier this year, which perhaps would have resulted in this pattern being emerged, right? So that's an interesting point from a Cuban perspective. Another interesting one is if you just drill down for Iran, which is at the 7th position, all of a sudden you will see that almost 90%, you can say that almost all the cases where the calls got terminated to Iran, the calls were actually originating from Turkmenistan, and the SIMs involved were from Afghanistan. And if you're familiar with the geographies, these three countries, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, and Iran, they have a significant portion of common border. All the three countries are adjacent, and they share a significant common border between them. Perhaps this indicates towards a syndicate of fraudsters actually coming together in this region to perpetrate the fraud. The last one which I would like to touch upon is the oceanic region. If you just look at the oceanic region, in terms of terminating, there is a small portion of almost 2% of the calls which were getting terminated to oceanic region. In almost half of the instance, the calls were getting originated from Africa, and the SIMs involved were from Europe. So with that, I would like to hand it over back to James. James, do you want to take the control?
Yep, sorry, just trying to take myself off mute there. Yes, I will do that. Hold on one second. And I think what we should do now is return back to that original quiz that I raised before. Hold on. So hopefully you can see my screen now. So returning back to that original quiz before we go into a discussion on the value of fraud, and we'll do some polling as well. But on this quiz, I asked you for the average of whether you think fraud occurs at the weekends as opposed to weekdays. And you can see in the data we presented, clearly there's more of a trend for a higher proportion of fraud to occur at weekends. And I think if we were looking at the value of fraud rather than simply the number of cases, it would be much, much higher. Which month would you expect to be the peak for the number of fraud cases? It was really inconclusive. There is a rise around June, but with the variation that happened from year to year, it seems to be fairly inconclusive. And which month would you expect to be the lowest for the number of fraud cases? And again, no consistency for a low volume month. Which country would you expect to be struck by the most cases of fraud? From an HP perspective, it was Brazil. And then which countries would you expect to have the most cases for originating call fraud? That was Spain and the USA, which were both pretty high. So that's the answer to the quiz questions. In the statistics that we've just been presenting to you, we have a lot of very valuable people and with valuable opinions on the call. I would love to hear from you. If there are different things you think we should be presenting with regard to statistics, it would be good to get your feedback on this. We've specifically chosen to focus on the roaming data because we found as we analyzed the data that roaming gave us a very good distribution. As I said at the start, this covers about 150 different countries. It's a good distribution of data. In an initial presentation I did, I think it was at the CFCA, I included some domestic data, and we found that the domestic data colored the results a bit because some particular countries had very specific problems with wholesale frauds between neighboring countries, and that rather distorted the overall statistics. So by focusing on roaming data, we've got a good coverage and a good set of statistics to look at, and we'll continue to build this over time. So now moving on to measuring the value of fraud prevented. So as I said at the beginning of the presentation, we believe that it's important to have some consistency in how fraud is measured, and if we focus on just looking at how much fraud is detected, the faster we detect it, the smaller that number becomes, and it looks as if our job is becoming poorer and poorer, where we're detecting less and less fraud, or actually we're just catching it faster and faster, which means we're doing a good job. So what do we do about that? And do you think the industry needs a standard measure for the value of fraud prevented as opposed to detected? If we could have a standard approach to looking at the value of fraud prevented, that might help you benchmark how your company is performing within your region or compared to the globe. So I'm advocating that we should be considering measuring in a standard way how much fraud is prevented. Now, there's a way of doing that, which I'll come on to in a few minutes, where we could apply that very consistently. But meantime, please look at that poll and submit an answer to just say, yes, you do think the industry needs a standard measure for value of fraud prevention, or no, you think it's rather irrelevant. I also think that if we were to standardize this, then when you're talking to your CFO or your finance director or whoever, you can say what you're doing in the way you're measuring it is, even though you may not want it published outside your company, it could well be confidential data, you could still be following a standard principle that's shared across many operators, and therefore you're following a certain degree of rigor there in standardizing the results. So you can see that you can tick on the yes or no buttons on the survey results there. And I think the survey, the poll has just ended. So what we'll do is just look at the results to see what the opinion is of the people on this call of whether we should be looking at a standard measure of the fraud prevented. And I apologize, I should have, hold on a second, I should have put the poll question up more clearly. There you go. That was the question I was trying to answer, but you had that in the poll in any case. So we can look at the results of that poll, and you can see that some people haven't responded, but generally for those who have responded, people do believe we should be having a standard, or the industry does need a standard measure for fraud prevented. The next question to look at is on the average duration. Now, the reason this is important is if we know the average duration of a fraud case, then we can use that to actually measure how much fraud you're preventing. If you know that every fraud case globally, on average, lasts 24 hours, and you always detect it in 1 hour, then you're saving yourself 23 hours worth of fraud. So if you know the hourly rate of fraud for a given case, you can calculate how much fraud you're actually preventing. But the big question here is, how long is a typical fraud case? And you have to remember, this is a global view we're trying to look at. And in some parts of the world, people are very quick and aggressive about detecting fraud fast, and they're doing it 24/7, every day of the week, every day of the year. But in other parts of the world, that's not the case. So it could be that people go home at the last minute of the working week, and as soon as they've gone home, the fraud starts, and that fraud will continue if they're not monitoring through the weekend until they come back into the office on Monday. And so the length of time for which average fraud cases can continue can be really quite long. And I've been surprised just how long people say it is. But I'd be interested in your view of, is it 6 hours, is it 12 hours, 18 hours, or even 30 hours? If you could indicate against those radio buttons what your vote is. I think we already have a vote in here. In a minute, we'll get the results to see what you think we should be saying. Now, it seems that quite a few people are saying 6 hours, and quite a few people are saying 24 hours. So a variety of response, and I'd expect there to be a variety because this will vary from operator to operator and from region to region. And even if you're an operator that's very aggressive about it, you're looking at, not from your own point of view, but from a global perspective and saying, yes, you do understand, but in some parts of the world, it goes on for longer. So this is something we are going to take a stab at in Cineverse and say, we're going to assume it's always lasting this period of time. And I think we'll probably go for the 18 hours because we've been studying it, we've been talking to operators, we've been looking at survey results from other groups as well. And there is quite a strong indication that it's around the 18-hour, 24-hour mark. So taking a conservative view, if we look at 18 hours, then we can say if you prevent fraud in, say, 2 hours, that's 16 hours of fraud you've saved. That becomes measurable. So this is very helpful for us to look at the value of fraud prevented. So to calculate the value of fraud prevented, we would want to know the case value per hour. Now, the great thing about roaming data is it's easy to actually put a value on the cases because using IoT rates, as in interconnect operator tariffs, you've got a value for every call that's made, and you can look at how much time is it's reduced by, and therefore the value of fraud prevented. So we're quite likely to start publishing that data, and if you have an opinion on that, I'd love to hear from you. Right, moving on, because we don't have much time left. The value of statistics. In your view, what is the ideal frequency for Cineverse to publish its fraud management statistics? Do you think we should be putting something out every month, maybe once a quarter, every 3 months, or every 6 months, or every year? Again, if you could just submit your opinion on those radio buttons on the poll there, and then we will look at the results of that. Our intention is to put out a regular paper on these statistics. It's just a question of we don't want to swamp people with too much information, but at the same time, we've said all through this presentation, it's the trends that are important. It's not necessarily the absolute numbers. It's the trends that are so important. So having a regular review and a comparison with times gone past could be a good thing to do. The question is, how often should we be doing it? Interestingly, the CFCA does it about every 3 years, but there they are polling for information with surveys and so on. It's a much more complex process to get that information. Here, we believe by using real data, it's firstly easier to get it together faster, And secondly, it's unbiased because it's coming through as statistical data immediately. So the answer we have here is fairly even spread. Some people are saying it'd be good to have it monthly. Some are saying about every 3 months. So we'll look at that and make an opinion. If you want to raise your comments to us separately on that, we'd love to hear from you. So really this brings me now to the conclusion from the presentation today. We don't have many minutes for questions, but as a final bullet, I would ask you to stay tuned. We'll publish reports during 2017, and if we think that the value of fraud prevention is going to be valuable to you generally, then we'll be measuring that and putting that data out. We'll set a benchmark in place. And to be honest, it doesn't matter too much what that reference point is. As long as it's credible and as long as it's used consistently, we can then look at the value of fraud prevented and look at the trends. The absolute figures are not what's important. It's the trends that matter here. So in conclusion to today's presentation, there's no noticeable seasonality that we've seen. We've seen the days of the week do have a trend that's repeatable year on year. We believe it's valuable to understand the dominant countries that are associated with fraud because that could help you to identify specific patterns. If we know where, or by all probability, certain patterns arise, then we can look out for those patterns and use that in the detection of fraud. But we have to understand there are always going to be exceptions to that. And then there was a consensus on the average hours duration of the case, and we've said, well, there's a mix of opinions, but it seems that the weight of opinion is towards the 18-hour, 24-hour period. So are there any questions in the last couple of minutes that you would like to put? Just an opportunity for a couple of questions if you have any questions. But if you don't want to submit questions now, you can also get in touch either with Jason or with me, and I put the email addresses there. So submit your questions through the Q&A link on the web. I'm afraid we can't do it verbally because of the number of people involved, but if you want to submit a question, feel free. Dan, do we have any questions?
We do, James. We have a question about really a drill down on French roamers, but I'm not sure it's going to be practical to do that in the time we have remaining. So the originator of that question, rest assured, we will get back to you post this webinar with an answer to that.
Okay. Any other questions? So do get in touch. If you have questions after the event, we'll be happy to respond to you on those. But if you have opinions on what you'd like to see in a future event like this, please do let us know that as well. Either email Jason or email me, James Stewart. And with that, I think it brings us to the end of today's presentation. So thank you very much for bearing with us and for joining and listening. And I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it useful. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you.